Good day, ladies and gentlemen. As many of you are aware, there's a Ministerial Task Team that's been established to look at shutting down the captive lion breeding industry. As wildlife ranching in South Africa, we've been at the forefront questioning the motives and the operandus of this task team and what they hope to achieve. Recently, we were approached by Kyknet's program in Gesprek met Lourensa Eckard, where we gave an in-depth interview of almost an hour. Unfortunately, due to time constraints, they only aired what was close to about 2 minutes of WRSA's views, focusing specifically just on the regulatory side, not focusing on any of the other topics that we discussed. We've decided as WRSA it's important that our members and that the broader public outside knows the truth and knows the actual facts of what's happening with the lion ranching industry. What is even more concerning is that Dr. Kelly Marnovic, who was also interviewed, recently published in an article in the Beeld, as well as 1 or 2 other Afrikaans newspapers, that to date, only one lion farmer has voluntarily come forward. That was one of WRSA's members, and we facilitated that process already on the 14th of April. So the question now gets asked, why do we need to extend this task team's time frame if they're only sitting with one person who's asked to voluntary exit? The minister on numerous occasions told us before this task team was established that people were lining up at the NSPCA and at the department saying, please take our lions. Help us voluntary exit this industry. But now we get told after months that this task team's been active, that to date they've still only got one person that's come forward, but yet they need an extension on the time frames that they require for people to voluntary exit. It doesn't make sense, does it?
There are some people who wish to exit this industry voluntarily have arrived at the door of the SPCA and have said, please take our lions. I don't think at this stage the panel would like to be interrogated about how many people have come forward. I think we must give that panel space to do its work in an appropriate manner.
What's a huge frustration for us as WRSA is the fact that the game ranch that's actually come forward and said, yeah, I'm willing to voluntarily exit, is one of our best game farmers in the country. It's a game farm that was awarded Game Breeder of the Year 2014. Is this the type of person that's damaging brand South Africa? Absolutely not. It's one of our best prime examples of people that are doing things right and breeding correctly. And the worst part is we highlighted to the task team, take away the economic incentive of lion breeding and lion hunting, that 4,000 hectares of marginal agricultural land that isn't viable for any other form of agricultural land use becomes unsustainable. If you even just look at wildlife ranching alone on that ranch without lion hunting, it's not financially viable. So it's a death trap for anyone that they wish to give that land to. And the department hopes, or the task team hopes, to give that land to transformation. What are we transforming? We're transforming people into poverty because this task team is making wildlife and lions valueless. So here with the full interview, where we look at the complexities of the lion issue, not just the captive lions. You see, the message that we've sent out as an industry is clear. It doesn't help changing one lion cage for another and now saying, well, lions are in sanctuaries, so they're looked after. Captive bred lions are captive bred lions. Sanctuaries and lions that are bred for sustainable use through trophy hunting are the same. They're captive, no matter how else you look at it. And another important thing that this task team desperately needs to address before we'll accept anything. We often get asked as a wildlife industry, what is our benefit to conservation? Well, now we're putting the shoe on the other foot and we're asking the department and the minister, what does shutting down the captive lion industry do to benefit wild lion conservation in South Africa? When we have a biodiversity management plan that's been implemented since 2015 that doesn't even have a financial budget to be implemented, yet alone the skills or capacity required on the ground to do so.
Great. Okay, just a quick overview of the ownership and sort of breeding of lions in captivity in South Africa, please.
The most important thing that everyone always needs to equate is that South Africa's actually got 3 different categories of lions. you've got your wild, and then you've got your wild managed, and wild managed falls under the category of less than 100,000 hectares, of which there are in excess of 45 small reserves across the country. And then you've got your captive bred lions, which are your lions that are kept on game farms, kept in smaller enclosures, and kept in sanctuaries. And what's important to note is every single different type of lion or lion breeding or lion conservation is regulated by the Department of Environmental Affairs. You cannot own a lion without having a permit to do so, no matter what category you're involved in.
So if we're then talking about sort of the tiers then of ownership, and we're looking at captive bred and captive held lions then, you know, what's your take on government's sort of suggestion, this task team, that there should be a voluntary exit process?
So this process comes back from the first lion colloquium we had in Parliament. I'm speaking under correction, I think it was 2017, 2018, where then under the then Minister Edna Molewa, we had a debate about lions and about lions damaging Brand South Africa, etc. It was quite an extensive debate. It was quite nice to even see Brand South Africa themselves were there, and they made it perfectly clear that there's no such thing on their radar that we're damaging Brand South Africa. So there was a lot of debate about where lions fit in, what's lions' contribution to conservation, and how it's going to go forward. From the Lion Colloquium, we then had what we called the high-level panel report, which was brought under Minister Mokonyane, because unfortunately Minister Edna Molewa passed away, and she started this high-level panel to investigate not only lions but also elephant, leopard and rhino. So then basically the task team that's now been established has been established as an output from that high-level panel report.
What's your take on government's then their recommendation? Do you think it's a responsible way to address the concerns there might be? And we'll talk about the concerns after that.
So yes and no. We've always said if someone's doing something incorrectly, and if everything that you're doing with lion breeding has got a regulation, a management plan, it's got rules and procedure that needs to be put in place, that's been put in place by a national government and every single province that has got lion breeders in their province. There are rules that say you may not have so many lions in an X amount of area, you must have such a big area available for lions. So if people are breaking those laws, surely we can prosecute them. Surely we can challenge those people for what they've done. Now the concern that we have, we spoke earlier about the HLP report. So the HLP report, which is now being used to mandate this task team, is based on a majority view which was not more than 2/3, and a majority view with the fact that 2 other minority views were also raised. There was no consensus of that high-level panel. And you must remember the high-level panel was a diverse group from communities to landowners to scientists to NGOs. So all the people that actually have a stake or a say in lions and lion management were in the minority. So whose view have we really taken forward to now develop this task team and to task this task team? That's why WRSA has already taken a very strong stance. We've already submitted a PIA application to government to ask them all these questions. Minister Creasy said often in the news that many game farmers have come to her and said we want to voluntary exit, or lion breeders have come and said we want to voluntary exit. We were shocked when we were invited to the first meeting to discuss this, and we asked for a list and they said no such list can be provided. Okay, so then we did a survey amongst our members. Only one member came forward to say he's willing to voluntary exit, and the irony is it's one of our best game breeders in the country that was awarded the game breeder recognition by WRSA in 2014 for the best game breeder in the country. So we said to the task team, what's your net actually caught here? Your net hasn't caught the illicit or the bad behavior. You're actually catching the best of the best. And there seems to be this view that we are going to give lions, where are these lions going to go to? If we're talking, the high-level panel report suggested euthanasia. Euthanizing 8,000 lions, is that conservation? 8,000 plus lions. Is that some form of conservation?
to have negotiations with the Department of Agriculture that is responsible for animal welfare, to look into under what circumstances we could euthanize animals.
Now the argument is, no, we found a home for the lions. And our argument comes back to say, changing one cage for another cage doesn't change lion conservation. What is going to be the benefit of changing those lions from the area where they are under possibly our members or the other lion breeders' members to now some sanctuary? Is that going to make them now contribute to conservation? And the other question that needs to be raised is, what will shutting down the captive bred lion industry, how will it benefit lions in the wild in terms of conservation? And that's another answer that has yet to be provided to us. So in our PI application, we're looking forward to some good answers, because as an industry, WRSA is aware of 11 top-class lion breeders, people who are actively involved in it, scientists, well-known individuals that have done extensive research on lions that applied to be on the task team. Unfortunately, not one of them was selected. So that's another question we've asked in our PI application. We want to know who put forward their names to say we're willing to serve on this task team, and what was the selection criteria of choosing this task team. Because from our view, looking from the outside, the task team definitely looks skewed to a certain agenda.
Why do you think they are pushing and driving this agenda? What do you think grounds their decision making then? Is it what, like scientific? What are they using to justify this course of action? Because I'm getting the sense that perhaps WRSA is not in principle against having lions in captivity or lions bred in captivity, absolutely, provided the legislation is followed to the T.
And provided it's done responsibly. Animal welfare is our number one priority as an industry. I'm not going to have value for wildlife if they're in a malnutritioned or a poor state. No one's going to pay me to visit my game farm and see animals in a poor condition. I'm not going to be financially sustainable if I mismanage or mistreat animals. So as an industry, we are totally opposed to any form of welfare abuse or animal abuse regarding wild animals. And that point needs to be made poignant. And we've said to the department on numerous occasions, if there's an incident where one of our members is involved, notify us and we will help you prosecute them. We will assist you. Now the interesting thing is, what we've also brought forward in our PI applications is we've asked for these welfare concerns. And departments come back and say, no, we don't have any. We don't have any records. So we're getting a lot of mixed reactions. So the question comes back to, where's this stem from? And I think it's come to a lot of emotional exploitation. People's emotions are being exploited. If you take the 7 biggest NGOs that are involved in this space, we call them bingos, big international NGOs. They produced 3.5 billion rand in 2018, selling lion conservation, protecting wildlife. Why are we now sitting with a crisis that animals are not being protected? Why are we sitting with a crisis that all our provincial parks, the EWT report that's recently come out, are in trouble? Not one of our national or provincial parks that has lions is financially self-sustainable. They rely on donations, so they rely on government grants, etc., to bail them out. So where is the need for this call? It's about emotions that have been exploited. Yes, we utilize a lion. Yes, an animal dies. That's the fact of the truth. That animal is utilized for the benefit. And with that lion conservation, to be able to say now hunt a lion, it has to be hunted on an area of an excess of 1,000 hectares. What about all that land that's been now marginal agricultural land and been converted into habitat that protects other endangered species, that provides habitat for instance, if we were to use our property, blue cranes, bat-eared foxes, secretary birds. We've now got secretary birds nesting below our lodge on an open field that used to be ploughed for tomatoes and maize. That's huge conservation benefit. And that's what people don't understand. So everyone takes this emotional view but they don't understand the realities on the ground.
I want to just prompt you on the emotional view. Why do you think lions in particular, but big cats more broadly speaking, lead to such strong emotional responses from South Africans, but also from the international public? Sometimes I wonder whether lions are not being given more prominence because of the emotional side of things, and other species not, that perhaps need more conservation efforts around them.
So it comes down to Disneyfication. Lion King, everyone thinks you can cuddle a lion. This view, and we're sitting with a situation where, with all due respect, urban people are divorced from reality. If we ask in a meeting, when last did you pluck a chicken? When last did you grow your own vegetables? How many of the people can raise their hands and say, that's me? We're getting our food from factory farming, from shopping centers, from malls. Where does milk come from? No, it comes out from Pick and Pay. It doesn't come from a cow. So everyone thinks that wildlife is everything outside of where I am. I live in this little cocoon, and wildlife thrives outside of my area. So if we take the South African landscape and we talk about how much of the area is actually conserved, you're talking about less than 9% in protected areas and nature reserves. The wildlife sector is sitting on 17.2% of South Africa's landmass, close to 21 million hectares. And that includes 9,000 game farmers, as well as 7,000 mixed agricultural farmers. Now that land has not been taken from the wild. It's actually been recaptured from marginal agricultural land and rewilded for the benefit of wildlife conservation, which is huge.
What do you think the implications of this process may be if the government gets its way? What are the implications for then conservation of lions and other big predators that we have in the country if they manage to get this legislation through?
Okay, the first thing that we need to ask, if this industry has grown totally under this current government, this is not an industry that started in excess before 1994. This is an industry that has exploded under this regulatory government. What form of compensation are we talking about? Because everything that this industry has done, it's done with a permit, and it's done with approval, and it's done within the regulations of the department. So firstly, who's going to be compensated? Why must I just voluntarily exit my business? What is my benefit going to be? Because I've done everything to the letter of the law of the government. Now if you wish to shut me down, that's going to be huge legal implications, firstly. Secondly, what is shutting down captive bred lion breeding in the Free State going to have in benefit for Kruger or Kalahari, etc.? What is going to happen there? And we also need to look, everyone's always got this view, oh, we're talking about conservation. And let's quickly throw the hat around about conservation. Conservation for who? Conservation is the same as ethics. Your ethics, my ethics are totally different. So if we talk about conservation, and we raised this in Parliament, we said, let's base conservation then on a global perspective as per the IUCN. What is their conservation view of South Africa's lions? Right, the IUCN's report says the following. There are only 2 lion populations in South Africa that are considered to contribute to conservation. One is Kruger, the second is Kalahari. Mfolozi is potentially viable. The rest, non-viable. So all our small reserves are non-viable lion populations. That's why South Africa brought in the Biodiversity Management Plan for lions in 2015. Okay, that was identified to manage the small reserves as a meta-population and include them all as then one big population. That project itself, since 2015, it's now up for review to be restructured, has never been implemented. Why? Because according to our non-detrimental findings, we don't have the budget to even implement a national strategy for the management of managed wild lions, the second category. So if the government doesn't have a budget to manage those lions, how are they going to have a budget to pay out game farmers and lion breeders and take their lions and do what with them? The saying says they cannot be released in the wild. Okay, we've got different studies that show against that. You can study Dr. Paul Boyant's research that he recently did, where lions were released. We're also sitting with another situation. Kruger National Park, yes, the IUCN considers them as conservation value. Can those lions be distributed throughout South Africa? No, they can't. They sit with brucella, they sit with tuberculosis, and they sit with foot and mouth disease. So where must they go? Where must that expansion take place? When we're talking about expanding protected areas, along Kruger National's western boundary, there are 418 villages. Where must the people go? We're talking about 30 different tribal authorities, 68 wards. Where must those people go? Where must people be moved for wildlife? And that's why our model as wildlife ranching says, for wildlife to be sustainable, it needs to outperform other land use options. So if you can't make money from it, what's the benefit? We're going to convert our land to other marginal or to other agricultural land use options. And that's why we're sitting with the situation, all the managed reserves are non-viable. Why? Go do the research. Madikwe Game Reserve had a population of 110 lions. 3 years later, they had a population of 40. Why? Because they euthanized in excess of 70 lions. So we're sitting with managed wild lions that are being euthanized. Is the public even aware of this? So what is the conservation value? If they're not falling within the management plan, if we're having to euthanize them, but yet places like Madikwe Game Reserve are actually owned by communities, is that benefiting communities? The answer is no.
Taking into account everything you've said now and sort of the way government seems to be approaching this issue, do you think government is acting responsibly? And second to that, is this not perhaps rather brash then?
That's absolutely brash. Government's acting under pressure. And the truth of the matter is, government does not currently have the capacity on the ground to even implement this. In any scale, let's be completely honest. They do not have the manpower, they do not have the skills, and they do not have the resources to utilize or to even implement this, yet alone manage our current situations. If we have a look, for instance, take Ezembelu. Ezembelu in 2022 had an operational budget of 1.1 billion rand. But yet now they want to bring out a human wildlife conflict policy where game farmers must fund a policy for animals that escape out of their parks and attack and kill livestock or injure people. Why is it our responsibility? Why is it not being managed correctly? The EWT report, to come back to that again, is a huge dilemma. They do not have the capacity. And if not one of those protected areas are viable or potentially viable and self-sustaining, what model are we trying to put forward? The captive lion industry is driven on finances. If it wasn't financially viable, no one would be in it. And that's part of the pressure that's being created. Since 2019, Minister Creasy's not issued a bone quota for lion bones to be exported. That's putting financial and economic hardship on lion breeders, and she admits to doing it openly. She says, I've created the hardship. Now you're offering a voluntary exit for a hardship that you've created.
I have not issued, since the end of the 2019 financial year, I have not issued a quota for the export of lion derivatives. So there has been no legal export of lion derivatives.
So I mean, I just want to get to the sort of the nut of the thing then. Who's applying this pressure on government? Is it you alluded to NGOs, the bingos? Is government in a way beholden to the IUCN and these big NGOs? Why this push?
Okay, so separate the bingos from IUCN.
Okay.
IUCN is supposed to be scientific based.
Yes.
And let's have a look again, coming back to conservation and understanding that. Recently, WRSA took the threatened or protected species regulations that got promulgated. We took that and challenged that. Before the day we were supposed to appear in court, the minister withdrew the regulations. Why? Because we had good, strong facts behind this. One being, sable antelope in the country. According to the IUCN's red dot, or the red data list, the mammals, Southern African red data list, mammal species list, there's only 1,346 sable in South Africa. 1346. But yet, according to our data, that's been sold on auction since for the last 20 years, we're talking about 18,818. So if you've had close to 19,000 sables sold on auctions alone, not private sales, just auctions, but yet the data says there's only 1,346, it doesn't make sense. And it's because our animals in private ownership are not counted. These sable are not being counted, they're considered outside of their prehistoric distribution range. Because we manage our wildlife for optimal production, because we feed them, because we look after them, because we apply good sound felt management with rotational grazing, we don't just throw all our wildlife in one big large block and say let the best survive. We actually rotate them to allow the felt to rest, to allow your habitat to be in a better condition. No, that's not contributing to conservation, they're not counted. So the irony is a lot of our laws exclude us. The decision making is based excluding us, but then the laws that are put in practice are put on us. Protected areas were exempted in a lot of aspects from TOPS, whereas us as the game ranchers are not. So we're not being counted in the numbers of sable, but yet all the regulations being written are being enforced on us. And that's where we've got a huge problem coming forward. The pressure in terms of coming from outside factors is the money generated by NGOs. Follow the money. It's all got to do with it. Four Paws. Four Paws have got their own lion sanctuary, Lions Rock. Follow the money. Ask them where their lion sanctuaries are. Who's got what? Who's benefiting from what? And it's another form of money generation that people are making from this. By exploiting people's emotions, putting money in your pocket, and they're just using the lion to do that.
Then my second to last question is to sort of bring it back to what you've been alluding to, the guy that is following the rules, that is actually doing this in a responsible way, whether it be breeding lions or, especially the last two tiers,
Yeah.
If you chat to these people, and I know you did mention it briefly, what is their response then? If you say only one of your members came forward and said, I would voluntarily, get out of the industry, is there a sense of anxiety? Is there a sense of frustration with government and the way they've been doing things? And do these guys not feel kind of thrown to the wolves in a way, if I can put it that way?
Everything you've said there is completely correct. Anxiety, thrown to the wolves, exactly that, because there's a huge frustration. That guy's done everything according to the rule book of the department. Now they're requesting a voluntary exit. The task team has sent on 4 separate different occasions, please will we distribute to our members the voluntary exit. If there was such a huge call for members to exit the industry, why do we need to continuously ask people, do you want to exit? Why do we need to extend the time frame to try and find people to exit? And people that breed with lions, people that breed with any form of wildlife, yes, there's financial gain to be involved. Why? I need to put food on my table and I need to be able to create an education and raise my children. It's common factors of life. If there wasn't that financial gain, we wouldn't possibly be in that. But because there's a financial benefit, and because it is sustainable, and because we've got a passion for wildlife, that's the route that we've got. That's the route that we've gone in terms of breeding the lions. Now take all the rest of Africa. We're talking about lion populations. Lion populations are under threat. Our non-detrimental finding says that the captive lion breeding possibly acts as a buffer to protecting our wild lion populations, because it's a readily available product. It's utilizable. And we talk about wildlife conservation. In terms of the global world's perspective, we're talking about 8 million people. South Africa is the 25th largest population in the world, with now in excess of 60 million people. Take our land area of 122,000 square kilometers, divide it by 62 million, you're sitting with less than 2 hectares per person. Who can sustainably sustain themselves on 2 hectares? It's not the pressure of wildlife that's been forced, it's the pressure of people on wildlife that is the challenge. That's why we're sitting with 3.4 million people on the boundary of Kruger National Park. That's astronomical pressure. We're sitting with real unemployment of 44.4%. Where's the pressure going to come on wildlife? In reality, we need to have wildlife outperform other land use options. We can no longer tolerate wildlife in a cocoon thinking that's a protected area, we need to back off. Yes, we've got our government protected areas that are doing fantastically. Your Kruger National Parks, by all means, that's what they must do, and that's what government must monitor. But don't go now tell private areas that have created wildlife habitat for wildlife that was absent to now shut them down because you're not allowed to generate an income. That will be detrimental to all wildlife conservation going forward.
Then my last question is, and I know you speaking from the perspective of the WRSA and your members, but if we look at captive lion breeding and lions in captivity in South Africa, perhaps other big predators as well, do you have any concerns about things that might be happening in the industry or guys that are not following the rule books? And if you have concerns, what are the nature of those concerns? You know, because there's always this argument to be made, and I think maybe the department would use that perhaps to say, well, you know, these and these examples of people that are really stuffing it up and not doing it responsibly. Therefore, we feel we should be, you know, putting this process into action.
In all industries, you're going to have one or two dark horses. Let's be honest about it. But are those dark horses going to belong to a reputable organisation? So a lot of the challenges that we always pose to government is we say, yes, we're an NGO. We represent our members. There's nothing forcing someone to become a member of WRSA. So what impact do we really have on those? We can't challenge someone and say you're doing something illegally if he's not a member of ours. Our members have a code of conduct that they adhere to. Our members are passionate for wildlife and want to breed with wildlife. All forms of wildlife, not just lions. And when we talk about our members, we've got a diverse role of members. We've got some members that have nature reserves that are opposed to hunting, that don't have lions. We've got other members, yes, that have got commercial breeding enterprises and are more intensive, yes, and have lions. We've got a diverse role. And it's understanding that every role is different. The example we used earlier of the member that put his hand up to say he's willing to exit. He sits with a 4,000 hectare farm in the Northern Cape. That farm is only viable because of lions. All the other wildlife habitat that's there, all the other wildlife species that is there, is only viable because of lions. Take away those lions and you take away the economic incentive of that property. And the government's got this idea that they're going to give away those properties and those animals, those lions, for transformation. It's the worst thing you can do. You're transforming someone into poverty. Because take away that 4,000 hectares, try and convert it to any other form of agricultural land use, such as livestock. It's not viable. Not even potentially viable. Even if you keep it as a wildlife area, you haven't got the production to justify it. So you haven't got the economic drivers to justify a 5-6 million rand lodge that's on that property. And that's what people often overlook is the huge economic input and development that's taken place in our industry. We're talking about 20 million hectares times 15,000 a hectare. That's 300 billion just in land value. That's huge. That's our contribution. That's without any development. And that needs to be equated as well. While we're having task teams to appease people's perceptions, we're damaging those industries. We're sitting and we're making wildlife valueless and we're losing acreage. Since the previous and the last surveys that were done on rhino conservation, yes, the private sector's wild rhino population numbers have grown extensively. We now sit with over 65% of the world's white rhino population in private hands. Kruger National Park has lost 75% in the last 10 years. But what's really happened on the ground to rhino habitat protected areas? I know of numerous farms and it just said the risk isn't worth it anymore. I don't want to keep these rhino. And the studies are starting to show that hundreds of thousands of hectares are being lost that used to be there for rhino conservation that no longer is, because we're making the species valueless.
Thank you, Richard. That's a lovely statement. But this is really my last question, sorry. I'm worried, or I get a sense that when a general member of the public, a layperson, sees media around this, the impression might be created that there's an enormous crisis with regards to captive lion breeding and lions in captivity in South Africa, and that every guy that has a lion in his on his property, in a cage or in a smaller kind of enclosure, is evil, you know. Just from your perspective and your background and the research you guys are busy with, is there any crisis then with regards to lion conservation and captive lions in South Africa? Or is this seems to be blown out of proportion?
One crisis that we are sitting with is the species has been made valueless through legislative vacuums by not getting a bone quota. It's one of the worst things you can do. By putting the minister's admittal to putting the industry under economic stress is a huge, huge negative factor, and that is concerning for us. But I come back to the previous statement. Everything that's happening within lion breeding in South Africa is under the regulations and control of the department. If it was really so bad, if it was so really out of control, shut them down. Take their permits. Fine them for what they're doing incorrectly. Throw the book at them. You've got the law behind you. Why is that not taking place?
Quickly just raise the genetics point for me.
Alright, so basically we were also sitting genetically wise in South Africa. The managed wild lion population stems originally, majority of them, from Madikwe Game Reserve in Pilanesberg and have been distributed. And there's been concerns about their genetic integrity. Everyone always says that the captive bred lion industry is hugely inbred. That's why WRSA embarked on a project many years ago that's now borne fruit to examine, at least on paper level, what the genetic integrity is of lions. It's the biggest study ever conducted, looking at captive and wild. The results were the captive lion breeding industry is actually more diverse than the managed lions and on par with Kruger National's lions. So genetically they're not compromised. And it boils down to that same topic which we spoke about earlier. Do you think I want to have a weak lion on display that represents my brand and represents my business to tourists? Of course not. I want to manage it to the best opportune possible to make sure that I've got a stable population. Because if my population is not viable and is not stable, my business is not economically viable. The question I want to ask the public out there, what animal has ever been bred to extinction by a farmer? Not one. And that's the benefit that we generate as an industry. We've created the wildlife habitat. When we talk about 20 million head of wildlife in South Africa, 80%, 16 million thereof, is in private hands. Only 4 million, 20%, is in protected areas. Why this huge value? Is because we're looking after wildlife and we're doing it on marginal agricultural land that is non-viable for other industries.
Brilliant. Thank you, Richard. That is super. You gave me so much. Thank you. Really, I really appreciate your time.